Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our podcast on leaders and leadership. Today, I'm very happy, I'm very excited because the person I'm having to interview is very vast on the topic of leadership within the arena of politics. He has occupied position at the United Nations office in New York and also at the African Union. And of the African Union, we're going to spend some time on it. And then, of course, we're also going to look at Pan-Africanism, also because the idea of African unity, African brotherhood, is not something that is new. It's not something that even started with Pan-Africanism. This is something that has been there for thousands and thousands of years. So saying that it should have been the parameter upon which African leadership are based on is not an overstatement. I just want to point out that this interview, unlike some of the interviews that you would have noticed that we have been doing, actually long. It's going to be a long interview. So I'm going to split it into different sections so that they become easier for you to consume. So wherever you are listening to this podcast, whether you are listening at YouTube where you are going to see the video version of it, or you are listening in Spotify or in iTunes or in Google Podcast, you are going to see that the different parts are listed next to each other so that you can listen according, of course, to the time that you have at your disposal. I just want to point out that if you notice anything in the framing, it's because the one I recorded before during the interview, there was a kind of glitches in it. The audio was bad. So I basically have to re-record this intro and also the edit part of it, since I have the time to do it with a better camera that I'm using here. Now, there is one thing that I really want to point out about the importance of quality leadership in Africa. And of course, I'm talking to the African people in this respect, in that leadership is like a coat that you sew for yourself. Now, you don't make the decision after you already get the coat that you are putting on. You make the decision before you sew the coat, the kind of coat that you want, the size, the color, and everything. So in terms of the person that we elect into the position of authority, in terms of the person who we give our power, having a political leader, having a president, a governor, or a representative basically means giving your power to somebody to lead you. So the people that we choose to lead us need to have certain quality. We need to be very careful the kind of people we choose. Because the moment we choose them, we're going to have to abide by how they lead us. Because whether we like it or not, they are leading us to somewhere. They can be leading us to destruction or leading us to prosperity. But for the meantime, we have given them the power to do this. This is why it is very important that we understand the basic concept of leadership and what we expect for the people that we elect into the position of authority. Okay, Professor Costantinos, I really want to thank you for having accepted to talk to me on the question of leadership about Africa and the situation, of course, that we have relating to leadership in different parts of Africa. And of course, we're also going to consider the African Union, like I've just alluded to in the intro. Now, can you say something about yourself for the sake of those who are probably seeing you for the first time so they can have a background about you?
My name is Costantinos, and I've been working with the United Nations as a senior policy advisor in New York. I've also been working in several African countries on policy issues and, of course, program issues. I've also served at the African Union as chairperson of the Advisory Board on Anti-Corruption for 2 terms. Now I'm teaching public policy at the master's and PhD level. I'm also doing some consultancy in terms of finance, not consultancy per se as a consultant, but to help African countries to raise resources in foreign direct investment. I have also published several books and numerous papers. So I'm more into the academia and finance now. Thank you.
Oh, that is fantastic. Thank you so much for that. At least it helped the people to understand where we are coming from, a little bit of your background and all that. I think that is very important. Okay, now I will start with the paper that you published, the recent one, which had to do with Pan-Africanism and, of course, leadership as it were, because Pan-Africanism, we are looking at what is the best way so that Africa can sort of be self-reliant, they can produce what they eat and eat what they produce, and also be able to participate in the international community. Now, can you give me a brief presentation of the promise and pitfall of Pan-Africanism according to how you have presented it in your story?
Well, you see, Pan-Africanism historically it started as a movement to liberate Africa from both slavery, colonialism, and also it became to represent the entire Black people globally. And of course, more of the activists were in the United States, but eventually that activism developed also in Southern Africa. And specifically, because of the long history of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it started as Ethiopianism in South Africa, and eventually it spread globally as a Pan-Africanist movement. The Pan-Africanist movement gave a major impetus to the movement when in Addis Ababa, the heads of states and governments came to set up what you call the Organization of African Unity. It's more than 50 years now since the Organization of African Unity has been formed. It has been transformed into what you call the African Union. And there are several programs now to unite Africa both on trade and other more political issues to be able to develop a continent that can use its own resources to develop a continent coming out of the colonial and slavery oppression into a more freedom-loving peoples of Africa. So this has been the major objective in freeing Africa, both from poverty and also from the legacies of colonial and slavery oppression. And of course, after colonialism, we had this militarism. More than 110 military coups and counter-coup d'etats have been undertaken. And therefore, the democratization of Africa also becomes a major impetus now for the African Union. So Pan-Africanism, in a nutshell, represents the freeing Africa from the shackles of poverty and also dictatorship. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Costantino. Now, my curiosity now is trying to understand if the African people actually understand the basic concept of the Pan-Africanism as an idea. Of course, brotherhood is not something that is new, okay? Well, whether we are talking of the ancient Egyptian or looking at the ancient Sudan or looking at the whole of Africa as it were, the concept of brotherhood is not something new. But the way that it can be defined by Pan-Africanists, that in this era where everybody is protecting their interests, Africans should also protect their interests based on their collective survival, as it were. Whether we are looking at Marcus Garvey or looking at Marcus Garvey, of course, who were more concerned about the African diaspora and then, of course, the root where they are coming from, which is Africa. And then, some other prominent Pan-Africanists like Dr. Nkrumah Kwame and the rest of them. Now, the question is, of course, I'm going to ask you another question related to this one later in the interview. But now I want to ask you, do you think the African people really understand what is meant by Pan-Africanism?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer because Pan-Africanism was an elitist drive by people who've been conscious of the need to liberate Africa. Otherwise, the biggest problem in Africa have been conflicts between states, tribes, ethnic groups, and therefore the opportunity for the spread of Pan-Africanism as a concept within Africa has been very, very limited. For example, there is very little in the educational curricula of African countries to show what Pan-Africanism is. Much of the Pan-Africanism consciousness that have been developed within the African continent and the African people was the liberation movements from colonialism. And then, of course, because of this, most of the elite leaders that came, you mentioned Kwame Nkrumah, Emperor Haile Selassie, Julius Nyerere, all this, they tried to carve some kind of an ideology that would push us into this. But because of the Cold War that dominated the era of African liberation, some of them went into what you call African socialism, the other camp went to the capitalist camp, and therefore it was very difficult to have a coherent voice among African leaders themselves to be able to develop an African agenda of an African people. So it's very difficult to say that this concept has really matured within the African continent to a point that it becomes an ideology or even a kind of meme for African youth to develop that concept at the grassroots level. So I wouldn't say Pan-Africanism has really permeated African societies to a large degree.
All right, now looking at the whole concept of leadership, because the Pan-Africanism, of course, looking at also leadership, looking at how we will be able to navigate our ship to the destination where our common interests become of importance to us. Because if you go to negotiate, for example, the Chinese are in Africa, we know that the Europeans have always been there, the Americans have been there, they will always be there. They are there for their interest. We should not expect them to protect our interest. That is not their interest. So I think that by Pan-Africanism, by the Pan-Africans idea, Africans were supposed to understand what is their interest at the international community and able to protect it. I think this is also the very basic of leadership, because when you are a leader or when you have quality leaders, something that of course we are going to talk about for a long time in this interview, then of course you should know what the people that you are leading want, and you help to lead them towards the actualization of that. Now, looking at the general idea of leadership, how do you describe it? How do you describe leadership as a concept?
Well, leadership for me is when we talk about African leadership in terms of Pan-Africanism and of course the general development of the continent and well-being of its citizens, leadership is, it takes a leader to chart out good policies and practices. And of course, this also requires the momentum for the kind of transformation we're looking at. Most of the African leaders we have now since 1991, with the spread of democracy after the fall of the Soviet Union, we see elections going in Africa. And much of the elections that we see have been hampered by different happenstance. If you look at the Francophone Africa, we have what you call the Franc-Afrique. Al Jazeera has documented this so well that the interference from foreign powers in terms of choosing our leaders have been phenomenal. And also on the other side, you can see that African countries have developed tremendous amount of democratic credentials. But the point is, the institutions, the political institutions and political rules that we have in Africa have not been respected by the very people who wrote the constitutions. In the first place, we have term limits in some countries which have been changed several times. In second place, we have gerontocrats running the continent today. Most of our leaders have been very, very old, except some, a few of them that are quite young, like the Ethiopian leader who is in his early 40s. But the point is, leaders, once they come into power, they want to continue staying there. The second thing is the opposition contestants don't come up with a new vision of nations in Africa. And therefore, what happens is they become attached like an umbilical cord to the existing system. And therefore, they want to build the system through the kind of system that African leaders have developed. So post-colonial leaders in Africa, after the countless military coup d'etats and counter coup d'etats in a new democratic era, are not really maturing into the 21st century. And of course, there is also the global impact of the decline of democracy in the West itself, with the populist movements coming up in Europe. We've seen populist movements coming up in North America. And therefore, the pressure from populist movements in developed democratic nations today is also being seen within the African continent. So the kind of poverty and human insecurity that we see in the African continent is predicated on the fact that the power holders are there to exploit the resources of the continent. Africa loses something like $158 billion a year to illicit financial transfers. And yet the aid we get is not even 10% of that. Africa has conflicts going on simmering. For example, if we take the Democratic Republic of Congo, it has an estimated wealth of $24 trillion. But Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has rich flora and fauna, it has rich mineral reserves, but the problem is there is such continuous war that it has become very difficult even for the World Health Organization to contain epidemics like Ebola in the DRC. So African leaders at different stages are developing, and there is also pressure from the African public, the African elite, and the international community to reform the kind of governance systems we have.
Hey, I hope you're having a good value from this podcast. Now, in case you want to improve yourself, we do have an e-learning community where you can learn anything from learning how to use computer, build a website, or set up a home business for yourself. All these and many more are available by becoming a member of our e-learning community. And it costs you as little as 65 cents per day. Of course, this is something anybody can afford. How do you get started? It's simple. Just go to Google and type aclasses.org or write me a personal email at obehi@aclasses.org, and we will set you up for your self-improvement journey faster than you can imagine. I repeat, aclasses.org or obehi@aclasses.org. Now, let's return to the podcast.
The leadership system we have today doesn't match up with the kind of leaders that are required to make history in this continent. Some leaders have made history, but the point is, as leaders want to continue to be in power, then they make so much mistakes that eventually what you see today in the current elections that are going on in Africa in 2020 have been contested so much that opposition politicians don't even have a space, political space, to be able to compete. So the leadership we have doesn't really match the kind of leadership that we teach in business schools and the leadership we teach in public policy for our students.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Costantinos. Now, this inefficiency or deficiency, if we want to refer to the problem of leadership in Africa as such, is it something that is based on our inability to understand? Because when you look at great empires in Africa, for example, look at the Empire of Mali, as huge as the Empire of Mali, there were a lot of diverse people inside. There were, and it was able to be governed by a system. It doesn't need to have 20 presidents to run it. There was one leader, then of course triple down to the local, then the regional. Then it was properly administered. If you look at the ancient Sudan, the same is true. The same also is true for the ancient Egyptians. So what I'm trying to say is that, actually my curiosity is that what we have been demonstrating, our incapacity, is it based on ourselves as human beings? Or is it because somebody is manipulating us so that we are not able to do what we are supposed to do? That is actually what I'm trying to understand from you.
Well, you see, I don't think the African narrative is as bad as we think. Initially, if we look at history, the first states that were formed globally were in Africa. The Nubian state here in the Horn of Africa. And then we had kingdoms and mighty armies that really governed their people properly. Of course, Africa has authoritarian traditions, and it had also democratic traditions. If we look at the empires like Mali, Dahomey, Songhai, Aksum, these are big empires. In fact, Aksum had stretched to the Gulf and to Southern Africa. And of course, they have their own governance regimes of forming states that are going to be responsible to maintain their people. Unlike what the Westerners try to promote Africa, Africa is not a continent of guerrillas fighting each other eternally. But eventually what really happened is after the colonialists left, there was a gap in governance, and they handed over the reins of public administration to the people that they have trained to be able to run the continent, but again maintain their own benefits. Western powers still maintain tremendous amount of leverage in African politics, and therefore keeping the public at where it is and not creating human development processes like education, healthcare, and ensuring some kind of livelihood security for the African people has never been an agenda for African governments. And the problem, of course, is African governments have the African Union, but the African Union is a club of governments. If you see at the Constitution of the United Nations, it says, "We, the people of the United Nations," when it starts. But the African Union Constitutive Act, it says, "We, the leaders of Africa." It says, "We, the heads of uh, governments and heads of states of Africa." Therefore, this doesn't really represent a popular movement in its entirety. What we need to create is a popular movement where African youth now that have been exposed to education and social media to be able to convert what the founding fathers of the African Union wanted to do about Africa into realities. And this reality should be not a populist agenda, an ethnic agenda or tribal agenda, but an agenda that would transform the continent into one of the greatest seeds of development and not the kind of aid dependent continent that we have today. The people of Africa have survived long before governments, NGOs, donors were there. Africa is the birth of humanity. And therefore, what we can see now is the kind of survival strategies they have, the kind of adaptive strategies they have to different stress and shocks from, let's say, the climate, from economic stresses, from natural disasters. They have survived all this. And therefore, what we need to build in this is to have an African leadership that, one, can make the reality of, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is going to be an opening for this. But the problem with that is when African countries have conflicts in their borders, when we don't have the physical infrastructure to connect Africa, then it becomes difficult to come back to this reality. And therefore, it's important and imperative for African leaders to look into this. But I tell you, I've worked in 26 African countries through the different global governance institutions, and most African youths are ready for change. They want to change Africa, they want to change it from the backwaters of poverty and underdevelopment into a continent that is going to be more aggressive. And in fact, 5 of the 10 countries that have been fast growing in the last decade in terms of their gross domestic product are African countries. And we have to keep this momentum. But the leadership element is very important because what we need to do, take Angola, for example, the kind of resources that have been squandered by the previous regime. Now, a new regime is trying to right that up. We have several countries in Africa that I can tell you where massive human insecurity has been subjected into the people by the leaders themselves. They create conflicts deliberately. Most of the elections are ethnic based and tribal based. Some countries have graduated from this. And I can congratulate Ghana, for example, for putting it into law that no party should be formed according to ethnicity, tribe, religion, or any other affiliation except the political program of political parties for the well-being of Ghanaians. And therefore, this is the kind of movement that has to go all over Africa before we get, again, other forms of coup d'etat. There are countries that have had elected presidents, but the military has taken over. These elected presidents have been put in jail or killed, and these military leaders now, they undertake elections to be the new leaders. And of course, they maintain the status quo of corruption, the status quo of getting the African people not to understand their privilege and responsibilities of what that constitution gives them. And therefore, these are the kind of challenges that we have, and we have a long way to go. These are not the problem of Africans, frankly. We see riots of young people now all over the world. In Thailand, we see it today, in Venezuela, in Lebanon, all over the world, young people are rising up to the challenge of creating democratic states and to get rid of corruption and corrupt states. And therefore, this is the only way we can push Africa into the forward. And I think this digital transformation that's coming up into the African youth might be one element that's going to lead into this kind of global interaction and communication that would bring African leaders to be subject to some kind of accountability.
Thank you so much for that. Now, I wanted to ask you a question relating to the African Union. Of course, I'm going to ask you, but before that, I want to ask you something based on, of course, your explanation so far. Now, you look at a lot of government in Africa, of course, not all of it, but in a great part of it, we have very old people who are unwilling to relinquish power. So they run the system, like you were saying before, in a very tribalistic system. Even they say don't even understand where the world is going because they lack the proper idea. Take a good example from Nigeria. No? When they turned to democracy in 1999, the government that came to power, that of course stayed for some time, which before the current political party, which is the PDP, they had a policy. Of course, I want to believe that they tried to sort of dial down the tension in Nigeria. By that, they introduced what they call the rotation of government, where the government had to be from the south, then from there it moved to the north, then from there it moved to the west. But it's really strange, you know, because if you look at a more functioning democracy, maybe for example, in France or in Germany or UK or in United States, you don't really ask where the president is coming from. You are a leader of the country. If you are able to deliver, that is what the people want. Nobody is really asking you whether you belong to any particular ethnic group or things like that. Then, of course, okay, in Nigeria, you know that recently there have been a protest by the youth of Nigeria because they were protesting against the police brutality in the name of SARS and a branch of the Nigerian police that were very brutal in terms of handling the Nigerian public. Okay, the protest started from there, but how it resonates to a lot of Nigerians, both home and abroad, is that we are tired of the system. We want a change, but somehow the Nigerian government managed to put it under control after the violence. Of course, you might have witnessed what happened in Lekki Beach, Lekki Toll Gate on the 20th of October. So what I'm trying to say with this is that you are right. The African youth are willing for a change. They are ready for a change, but they are not in power. Those in power are not willing to relinquish the power. What should the people do? I mean, the younger generation who are really trying to effect a change.
Well, you see, you mentioned Nigeria, and I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of governance and public administration transformation we've seen through the decades. Of course, Nigeria has been under multiple military leadership. And of course, in 2000, when President Obasanjo was elected after he left President Abacha's prison, he tried to reform Nigeria, and of course, also to look into the immense amount of leadership corruption that exists in that country. Nigeria was, I must say, is in the right track now, given the record of the military governments that we had before. Even President Buhari, the military governor of Nigeria, himself now elected as the president. Nigeria has lots of resources, not just petroleum, but human resources. I must say that we might have more Nigerians well-educated than the entire sub-Saharan Africa combined. The problem has been the genesis of the governance process that has come up. Of course, Nigeria is divided into many parts. You have the Hausa in the north, you have the Igbo, you have the Yoruba, and therefore this ethnic complexities have been also been playing into the governance modalities in Nigeria. That also happens in Ethiopia, where ethnic federalism has become a very serious problem to challenge the kind of development that we need. You go to Uganda, it's the same thing with President Museveni, now looking at different kinds of tribal, ethnic, and religious connections to stay in power. We don't have the kind of icons that we can really emulate, except, of course, probably Mauritius and Ghana. But what is really important is for people to get organized. And of course, as you said, they don't have the enabling environment to do that. As we speak in Nigeria, the kind of challenge that the youth have, especially the special police force that was really taking measures, extrajudicial measures on the Nigerian youth, is a quite good example. And I hope the government will do something about it. But if we're going to continue with less empowered youth, then of course, the young people will have other alternatives. They'll take the power of the gun. The power of the barrel of a gun becomes an alternative. And this is what's really killing the continent, because our youth, instead of going to schools, they're learning how to manage machine guns. As we speak, we have a conflict in Ethiopia between the federal government and the regional government in northern Ethiopia. And therefore, these are issues where empowered youth are not there. Governance in Africa and leadership in Africa is the club of few individuals. If you take Nigeria, Ethiopia, or anywhere, you can see that it's a club of probably less than 50 people that are running politics. I can also mention to you in Ghana, the current president, a very erudite president, a very intelligent president, but he's been serving in different capacities within Ghana itself. So we couldn't create a new breed of leaders, because this has been sort of, the state has been hijacked. It's a kind of state capture that you see in Africa by a few individuals and interested groups that control both the security apparatus, the military, and the law enforcement in general. So once we try to get out of this, we might be able to create a system of governance. The other problem is, we talk about democracy, and the only issue in democracy that has been highlighted by the West and probably parachuted into Africa is the question of elections. But without developing the kind of democratic political culture we have, without the voters knowing who they're voting to, what they will do, they will only vote to the people they know next door. And these are their ethnic groups, these are people affiliated to them, or these are people who can use their finance to be able to sway the ideas of the young people that are going to polling stations. So I think that is going to take a bit of a time.